Hi, it's a warm day. I didn't realize. It's reached 23. It's sunny. I could be outside, but I'm inside because I'm marking. I'm trying to make a video resource about why, as trans people, people who undergo specifically transition from one gender to the other, to put it that way, not necessarily non binary people, although that is also a matter for discussion, particularly around pronouns. Why it is that people like me say, okay, my pronoun is she. And conversely, if you're transmasc or a trans man, why you might opt for he. Of course, there is some kind of wiggle room. There are those of us who are trans and non binary, right? And so she, they. So the reason why I am also non-binary is because I recognize characteristics in my relationship to gender that do not fit superbly into a binary perspective. And I think that many people who are queer also feel this. It's not just about feeling when it comes to our sense of our relation to ourselves, embodiment, and then others that gets expressed through gender. It's also something that's very deep-seated, and it's about how we become socially embodied in our becomings through our transitions, which are just trajectories which emerge from a whole history of incongruence, right? That we are seeking to ameliorate, address in some fashion. In transition, of course, if it's a non-binary and non-medical transition, it's a kind of accommodation through relationality as well. And that's where the declarative they might be pertinent. It is a speech act which brings into being what we're naming. So this is really important. It comes from the work of an important linguist that Butler also draws upon. But we can also see it within the work of post-structuralists such as Louis Althusser, when he talks about interpolation, how you're named brings into being who you are, right? Of course, it can be very problematic when it results in forms of criminalization or pathologization. So this is not just an issue of how we name through pronouns, but to be sure, calling into being, especially along the trajectory of transition and transexistence in the social world, we are calling into being what we see in ourselves and how we relate to others. So everyone's had experiences where they're not quite sure what the gender of someone is, and they're judgments that are made very much like a snap thing. For example, oh, is that a man or a woman? Now, this is not new to me. It also happens to so-called biological females that do not necessarily have an exterior presentation that is read as being proper of women. This throws into relief a lot of questions about how we define womanhood and femininity. But, you know, it can happen to so-called cis people, that is non-trans people as well. But I think that for both psychological well-being and social becoming, pronouns have an extra importance for trans people. So I wanted to address that in a proper video, but these are just some points that can help us to think about the issue. It's not just personal identity, gender as personal identity, or gendered pronouns as pointing to personal identity. It's also relationality. Which side do we feel, not even speaking about sides, but which kind of cultures and social spaces of gender do we feel that we are in? And, you know, transition is a form of labor and it's laborious. People will make mistakes, and I'm not going to make a big politics out of it. But in achieving a sense of congruence, not just within oneself, but also socially, the pronouns function to create a smoother conversation or communication, and to avoid those returns of disjunctures, disyuntivas, as we say in Spanish. So especially those embarrassing moments where, for example, in an airport or in a doctor's surgery, my documents basically reflect my lived gender, and someone uses the wrong pronoun, and that draws attention to me because not everyone will perceive me that way. In fact, no one may perceive me that way, except for someone who either has an issue with my trans embodiment, or, maybe makes a kind of mistake, the wrongful call, such as for those non-trans women who get assumed to be on the male side. And so correcting all of that is pretty laborious, but also it can create situations of what I call disyuntivas, of a major kind of flip, where we can be perceived differently by other people who have already included us within, for example, she, her. And I'm saying this rather emphatically because it is emphatic. Going forward, I just think that people who don't understand why pronouns are important maybe could read up a little bit about the power of pronouns and what they do through speech, as being enabling speech acts and performance speech acts. If you have a politics that rests on the notion that you must invalidate someone's expressed desire to be called she or he, then that is something you have to make a call on. I'm not saying that your whole politics has to change because of my particular lived experiences and survivability as a trans person in the world. But I am saying that as a form of communication, it is inappropriate to call someone in a publicly agreed context where the Speech Act functions by a gendered pronoun with which they do not relate. So you can do it in your own private time and space. Not everyone gets referred to as he or she reiteratively in conversation, especially if they're present. You just get called by their name. That can be a sign of your accommodation, that you just refer to me by my name, my proper name. You don't need to be using he or she if that's not what you subscribe to. You might see this as an ideological matter, as a feminist matter, but hey, here's another thing. Not all feminists see it that way. So anyway, but that is in your space and in your jurisdiction. Socially, if it puts trans people at some degree of risk, including different forms of violence or discrimination, it is actually an ethical imperative not to be doing the violence of naming, and that comes from Audre Lorde, of using a pronoun that in a lived context such a trans individual is not relating to, because you actually open us up to different forms of misrecognition and discrimination. So that's why it's an important issue to us. I hope that helps to understand it a little bit. Whether you agree or not, you can opt for options like proper name or in the presence of that person, not making a point of calling into account their gender.